we're studying, so it is written, so shall it be. So what we're doing is looking at prophecies that have been made. And we started out talking about doomsday prophecies that have been made in the more modern era of time. And in those prophecies that were made, we looked at various people, even in our time, that have said when the end of the world was going to come. And all of those things dates came and went. They weren't fulfilled. And so we moved on to there to look at the prophets from the Bible time and prophecies that they've made. And we're going to move on tonight to look at the Philistines. Brody said in his class just a few weeks ago, he said in his class that he wasn't for sure where the Philistines came from, the origin of them. And even though after I go through all of this tonight, we may still draw the same conclusion, that we're not 100% for sure where they came from. There is a thought of where they came from, and so we're going to look a little bit at that. Now, I don't want this to be political. I want it to be scientific, what I'm about to tell you. But this past week, it was revealed some doomsday prophecies that have been made more recently, since the 70s. And I don't want it to be political, because we be brethren according to the scriptures. And I want it to be that way whenever we finish this. But because some things have been said recently, we do need to look at them. And maybe eventually some of those things will come to be, but they haven't come to be on the timetable that was presented. In 1969, a biologist by the name of Paul Ehrlich warned that everybody would disappear in a cloud of blue steam in 20 years. He was talking about global warming. He said there would be famine, food shortages, and mass hysteria. So in 20 years, that was 1989, and that didn't happen. A political leader predicted by 2000, New York City would be underwater, and that by 2012, there would be no life left on the earth. When that date came and went, that didn't happen. So another failed prediction. In 1974, a scientist using satellite models predicted that there was a new impending ice age that was going to cover this continent. Of course, that didn't happen. In the New York Times, it was reported in 1978 that there would be a dramatic cooling trend that would put us at a stage of continual winter with no fall, spring, and summer. And that didn't happen. 1989 predictions were made that by 2000, nations would be covered with water. And that hasn't happened. Recently, it was said that Miami, Florida, and a good portion of Florida would be covered with water. And that didn't happen. ABC TV released a model back in 2008. And as to what the world would look like by 2015, that date's come and gone. All the Arctic ice would be gone. Both coasts, Florida included, would be covered with water, all the way up to the Appalachian Mountains on the eastern side and to the Rocky Mountains on the western side. Those dates have come and gone. Some people really take these predictions seriously that are made. They look at the information that they have, and it really causes sometimes a panic to ensue because predictions are made like this. So, just saying, from a scientific viewpoint, we need to be very careful that we don't say things that we can't back up along the way. It happens continually in the science field, and there used to be a time when scientists would just say things based on facts that they had, not on theories that they had of what would happen. Recently, more and more of scientists are saying that the theory of evolution, for example, is no longer a theory, even though they haven't proven it to be a law. And you just can't do that and really call yourself a true scientist. They deal in facts. And that's what they're supposed to deal in. So we need to be very careful with predictions that are made that regard all of mankind being gone, because we know what the Bible says about that. And I kind of think we know how that's going to happen, not every single detail, but kind of the general gist of what's going to happen whenever the world is done away with. So it is written in Scripture, so shall it be. God is not 0% right on his predictions. He's 100% right. And so keep that in your mind as we study this subject. Students of the Bible will quickly recognize the name Philistine. This name calls to mind a classic confrontation between Goliath, a giant, and a young shepherd boy, a poetic shepherd boy. Between manipulative temptress and Herculean strongmen like Samson. It reminds us of King Saul's last battle with the mysterious events surrounding the disappearance of the Ark of the Covenant. And yet for all of these memories that we have from these stories in God's Word, the Philistines hardly should be remembered as a fierce, war-loving, savage people who swarmed over Palestine. We sometimes think of them that way. But the origin of the Philistines is something that some people have studied, and they think they have connected a few dots here, and perhaps they have. Much of our knowledge of the Philistines is speculative. However, scholars generally agree that at least a portion of these people were once known as people of the sea. And their origin was thought to be around the Aegean Sea. And they were basically people who had mastered sailing. Here's what their trip looked like into Palestine. They were in this region with all these islands, the Aegean Sea. They had to rely on their sailing knowledge. They became masters at that. They also, because of where they were located next to Greece, they had to put that into effect. And when they got tired of all the battles that they were having to do, they decided in a very bold way, it's believed that these are the same people that came down from the Aegean area and came down into Egypt of all places and did battle with the Egyptian Empire. They caught Egypt during Ramses III's reign, and you've heard that name, Ramses III. He was one of the most powerful pharaohs in all of Egypt that ever existed. During Ramses III's reign, all of a sudden one day, I call them pesky Philistines, but they came out of nowhere. They came down and they invaded Egypt, and unbelievably, with all the battles that Egypt had participated in, these individuals caught them completely off guard and almost pulled off the biggest upset ever. Once Egypt finally regrouped, they pushed these people back to their ships on the coast of Egypt, and not long after, these people went in a northeastern direction, and it's believed that they settled on the coast of Palestine. The land that they eventually occupied was about 40 miles from north to south and basically had 5 major cities. Now, let me stop and make sure everybody's with me on the chart up there. So we're to the 5 cities now. Gaza, that area, even though Gaza, the city, doesn't exist, the region still does exist to this day. And you probably hear it on the news periodically. Ashkelon, Ashdod were the nearest to the coast, and then 2 landlocked cities, Gath and Ekron. So there were other cities that dotted the coast and the landscape of Palestine that were considered to be of the people of Philistine. But they never really controlled a sizable area of land. But they tried their best to. They never gave up on the dream to do battle and gain land. The Philistines had really two major things going for them. The first is the area that they settled was near a causeway via Maris, the road to the sea. And that put them in a beautiful place to where other people who wanted to trade with them could either on land come to that city or by the ocean or the sea come to the coastline and then get on that road and travel 3 miles inland, and then they could do their trading and all of that. So it really caused them, because of their location, you know, real estate people say location, location, location. And they had picked the good spot here for this city. And second, they had the ability to manufacture a lot of different items. Glassware, pottery, and all of that was a very high standard with them. Olive oil was another thing they traded in heavily, but their main product was iron production, which led to weapons and other things being built or made. Few nations have caused Israel as much of a problem as did the pesky Philistines. These two groups, Philistines and Israel, did not get along with each other for any length of time. Actually, one time they went 40 years without any major conflicts. But in between those other times, only a few years passed when they were doing battle with each other. During the Old Testament times, particularly during the life of Samson, who I made mention of a moment ago, and the life of David, multiple battles were fought with each other. Generally, well, I'm going to ask you this question. What do you think the conflict generally was over? Land. Land is what the conflict usually was over. And one group would possess the land for a time period, and the other group would regroup and then come back, and they would possess the land for a short time period. And it just went back and forth like this over time. Now, when God was with Israel, the Philistines didn't have a chance. But you can see just how vulnerable Israel was whenever they turned their back on God. Because it was at those moments that perhaps a weaker nation was able to step up and deliver harm to Israel. Among the 5 major Philistine cities, Gaza emerged as the strongest of those cities. It was located in the southwestern corner of Canaan, about 3 miles, as I said a moment ago, from the Mediterranean Sea, about 50 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And Gaza had a long, historic journey of its own. In Joshua 11:22, we're told that Gaza was the home of the Anakim. Now, that may sound like a Star Wars reference, but who were the Anakim? Group of people. Someone said it, I think. Oh man, I've got all kinds of time. I'll give you a hint. Starts with a G. Giants, right. They were the giants. Now, I want you to think about that just for a second. Because there is a little bit of a debate, not much, but a little bit, between scholars today that will look at that word Anakim and say, well, not necessarily was it talking about their height. That it could be a reference to their power. They were giants in that sense, renowned. But I'm telling you, it's talking about their height, all right? The Anakim were people of great stature, just like Goliath was. And, but they probably were men of renown also. If you think about all the things that they could do, back at that time as a 10-foot tall person, not just in battle, but the work that could be done. Men of renown back at that time. A lot of people believe Nimrod falls into that category, and we know what he did. He built many, many cities along the way. Gaza was also a major trading partner with Egypt. They were aligned, even though they had battles sometimes against each other. In fact, one time prior to the time that we're focusing on, Egypt had several fortresses around that area of Gaza. And so they were doing this trading with them, and they set up little colonies along there also to enhance that trading with this people. Gaza was so important because it was strategically placed. It was so important because it was a major trade center back at that time. And unfortunately, and the Bible's going to address this, one of the major products that they were exporting was slaves. And it was because of that slave trade that the prophets predicted the following. Amos 1, verse 7. The city would be burned. In Jeremiah 47:5, the city would become bald like a shaven head. In Zephaniah 2:4, the city would be abandoned. The predictions against Gaza were fulfilled in the latter part of the 4th century BC. So it was at this time that Alexander the Great rose to power. His armies prowled all over that region of Palestine, conquering many villages and towns along the way. Some of these victories came with much ease, while others required much time and energy before his armies ultimately won the victory. So basically, this is how this would play out. Alexander the Great had an army that nobody, if God didn't intervene, nobody in Palestine was going to be able to beat. Now, if God intervenes in that, that's a whole different story. But God's probably not going to intervene on behalf of the Philistines. And so all of these towns, one by one, began to fall to Alexander the Great. And generally, the way that would happen is the leaders of the town would look out and see this ocean of warriors that were coming at them. And they started raising the white flag. Generally, there wasn't even a battle that took place. And Alexander would come into the city, take a few of the spoils, but leave some because they surrendered. They would have to pay taxes to the Mesopotamians, and he'd go on to the next city. And many times, they still ruled those cities. They just had to pay the taxes. If they refused to raise that white flag, as we sometimes say, then he was going to swarm them and he was going to defeat them. And then, at that point, he was going to wreak havoc on that community. All the treasures in that town would be his, and many of those people would be sold off into foreign countries. So he was not really somebody to mess with. I was told a story one time. I have no earthly idea if it's true or not. But I was told that a king was going to resist Alexander. But Alexander wanted to meet with him before they did the battle. And so they parlayed a rendezvous, and they came together. And there sat the king on his horse with 2 people beside him, and Alexander on the other side with 2 men with him on horses. And the king said, I have this fortress, and I'm just not really all that worried about what you can do. And to which Alexander leaned over to one of the 2 men that were on the horses beside him and said something to him. And the man turned his horse and ran at a full gallop over a cliff. And immediately the king surrendered, because he knew he didn't have men that would do that for him. Now, again, I don't know if that's a true story or not, but if it is, it tells you how loyal those people were to Alexander and the length that they were willing to go to secure a victory. And we're going to talk in a couple of weeks about Tyre, a couple of weeks from now. The city of Tyre. And I'm telling you, he didn't give up, because that city moved from the mainland out to a little island that they'd built a fortress on. And for months, he spent months building a causeway from the mainland to that citadel on that little island to defeat those people. And part of that causeway that goes out into the ocean can be seen today. So that just gives you just a little bit of background regarding Alexander the Great. Probably one of the greatest military minds of his time. And he wasn't real kind to Gaza. According to history, he ended up getting wounded during his trying to take this city. And because he received that wound, whenever he did defeat the city, it was bad news for all of them. He literally wiped it off the face of the earth. History also tells us that the reason that he burned Gaza was because of that wound that he had, but it was in a fit of rage that he did that. It's important to note that after he burned the city, some citizens, after Alexander had come and gone, his time had come and gone, they tried to rebuild it. In fact, the city was attempted to be rebuilt 6 times, but after all 6 of those times it was destroyed again, it ceased to be attempted to be rebuilt. The second prediction, that the city would be as a bald head, a historian made the observation: the great Gaza of the Philistines is now a series of sandhills, covered with minute but manifold remains. It is so forsaken that there is not a single hut resting on the site. It is so bald that there is neither a pillar nor standing stones that mark the place where it once stood, nor is there a single blade of grass. Another city that was slated by the prophets for destruction was Ashdod. And in 1 Samuel 6:17, it was the only Philistine city on the southern coast of the plain of the seaboard. The city is spoken about at least 10 times in the Old Testament. It's also found in Egyptian records. 3 prophets describe the future of Ashdod. It will be turned to ruin, Zephaniah said in chapter 2, verse 4. It will be deserted, Zechariah said in chapter 9, verse 5. And it will be silenced, Jeremiah said in 47:5 of his writings. And there's no doubt that these were fulfilled. The Assyrian war army, the Egyptian war army, and the Babylonian war army, all within a 100-year span of time, attacked the city. Babylon was the 3rd army to attack the city, and after that attack, Ashkelon disappeared from all historical records. The ruins of that city have been located, and all 3 of the prophetic judgments have been verified. Ekron also suffered because of her wickedness. It was a 50-acre city, located 13 miles from Ashdod, 25 miles from Jerusalem. If you remember, after David defeated Goliath, the Philistines retreated to that city, Ekron. It was heavily fortified. It had a temple to Baal within it. It also was a commercial and agricultural center. It had the largest production in all of that area of olive oil. Over 300,000 gallons per year were produced in that city. And it also had the largest textile factories. Zephaniah offered one single prediction regarding Ekron. In chapter 2, verse 4 of Zephaniah, he says, Ekron will be uprooted. Now you might not, you think, well, that's pretty vague. Ekron will be uprooted. But that's kind of a jab to them, because the name Ekron means firmly rooted. And so Amos 1:7 was just as blunt. I will turn my hand against Ekron till the last of the Philistines is dead, says the sovereign Lord. These predictions came to be during the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians pushed through the land that the Philistines owned. Her citizens were deported and sold as slaves. To escape, some of them married into that nationality of people that were invading them. But as far as the people that we know as those from Ekron, they ceased to be. The prophets also made a prediction regarding Ashdod. Unlike the other cities in Philistine, Ashdod has never been located. They believe it was about 35 miles north of Gaza on the Via Maris, 3 miles inland. But it did gain biblical notoriety when the Philistines captured what possession from the Israelites? The Ark of the Covenant. So they captured that ark and took it into the house of Dagon in that city, one of their gods, a temple to them. Now that's an interesting story to me, because in that temple, the next morning when they came in, what did they find? Yeah, the idol was turned over. Well, they set it back up. They come in again, the idol's laid over again. I think it was the third time that they came in. It was laid over, but it was broken into pieces, with the ark just sitting there. So what else happens when they have possession of this ark? Yeah, they start getting sick, don't they? They have boils all over their body. Some of them die. So severe was it that they didn't even want to be around the thing. So rather than, get a caravan of people and take that thing back, they basically put it on a cart and they slap an animal on the backside and let the animal go with it, and it ends up getting back into the Hebrew possession. That temple that we were talking about just a second ago, it remained for hundreds of years before being destroyed by Jonathan Maccabeus. For further reference of the conflict between the Israelites and the citizens of Ashdod, you can look at Nehemiah and his rebuilding of the temple. It talks a little bit about all of this. The citizens understood the importance of having a strong military, and they had one. In fact, just as far as history goes, there was a 29-year war between the citizens of Ashdod and the Egyptian army. Now, I got that one out of order on here, and so I'm not even seeing it on that, but I've got it on out of order. So maybe I didn't put it on y'all's that I gave you, but I've got it on mine up here. But there was a 29-year war that took place, and they survived that war. The Egyptians couldn't overthrow them. Yet Amos forecasted her demise by writing, God will destroy the inhabitants. And Zephaniah echoed those sentiments. At midday, Ashdod will be emptied. All of that came to be, and her citizens faded into oblivion. Now, having detailed all of those 5 cities, the Bible prophets concluded their pronouncements by foretelling of the complete disappearance of the Philistine people. Jeremiah said that the Lord is about to destroy all of the Philistines. Zephaniah added, not one will be left. Zechariah commented that the Philistines would go the way of the Jebusites. An archaeologist by the last name of Davis explains, the Philistines have been destroyed so completely that there is not a single Philistine living anywhere in the world today. And another historian concluded, both Jews and Philistines adapt to the local Canaanite culture very well. But when both people went into captivity, the Jews came back from that captivity. But the Philistines left the stage of Near Eastern history and completely disappeared. A man by the name of Griffin, another historian, he also wrote this. The disappearance of the Philistine people, he believes anyway, was a complete disappearance during the Babylonian captivity, when they had survived the attacks of the Egyptians and the Judeans and the Assyrians. But during the Babylonian assault on that city, they were completely annihilated or sold off into slavery. How could these people who survived all of these great enemies eventually be wiped off the face of the earth? The answer, Philistia, did not survive because deity decreed it would not survive. So the prophets wrote, and so God fulfilled that promise. I want just for a moment for us to think about glory in the ordinary. Glory in the ordinary. There's a lot of ordinary things that we come across in our life that someone has spent some time to develop. And through the development of those things, we may still look at them as ordinary items. But in reality, because they have survived for so long, they're really extraordinary, aren't they? I want you to think just for a second in the Bible. It was just a piece of leather with a pouch on it and 5 smooth stones. There was nothing extraordinary about that piece of leather, that slingshot, and those 5 smooth stones. But look how God used that ordinary weapon to do something extraordinary to the Philistine people in the slaying of Goliath by that shepherd boy, David. To me, that's glory in the ordinary. It was just an ordinary sword, but the unique thing about the sword was in all of Israel, there were only 2 swords to be found. Can you imagine a one-time powerful nation of people only possessing 2 swords? What happened? What caused them to do that? One of them in the possession of King Saul, the other one in possession of his son, Jonathan. Do you remember the story? Jonathan has the one sword. So he prays to God with his armor bearer beside him. He prays to God and he says to God, God, I want to secure victory today for you. So when I finish the prayer, if the Philistines that are up on that hill yell down to me and say, come up here to us, I'll know that you've delivered them into my hands. But if they say, wait down there, we'll come down to you, then I'll know today is the day I die. Now, they said to him, come up to us. Is anybody seeing how that's a positive thing? I mean, in the great minds of military geniuses, I don't believe many are going to say, oh, I take that as a sign that we're going to be victorious. But he believed in God that much. And they did exactly what he said. And he went up that hill. The Bible literally says they clawed their way up the hill. So that wasn't even an easy thing to overcome. And then he went half a furlong, I'm not even sure what that is, into the battle, killing one Philistine after another. Until God sent this earthquake. And when the earthquake came, it woke all the other soldiers up that were sleeping in the caves, the Hebrew people. And it scared the Philistines so much they took off running. And then and only then did that army, the Israelites, God's chosen people, pursue the Philistines. But God took an ordinary sword and caused an extraordinary thing to happen with that. And they were just ordinary timbers and stones, all collected by King David to build a temple. But God wouldn't let King David build that temple because of sin in his life. God turned the job over to Solomon. Solomon hired this wonderful architect, and he, giving God the glory for it, assembled out of those ordinary timbers and stones a beautiful temple, a house of God, dedicated to God. They were just ordinary timbers and stones. Now think just for a second also, because God uses ordinary things to bring retribution too. I've talked a little bit about Habakkuk. While Habakkuk was talking to God and conversing with God, he wanted God to enact punishment to the Hebrew people because of the way that they were acting. So when God said, I got it taken care of, Habakkuk, even as we're speaking, I'm raising up the Chaldeans to come in and do battle. And you remember Habakkuk's response was, not the Chaldeans. They're vicious. Not them. But God was already in the process of handling the situation. Just an ordinary group of people over here. But he was allowing them to raise up an army whose horses, according to the scriptures, were going to be faster than anybody's. Whose swords would be stronger than anybody. Whose chariots would be put together better than anybody's. He was raising up this ordinary group of people that no one really paid too much attention to come in there and administer punishment to the Hebrew people. And there was a man by the name of Cyrus who God, 100 years before he was born, called him by name through one of the prophets. And this ordinary individual, this little boy, is going to grow up. And God's going to do an extraordinary thing through him in the defeating of the Babylonians in order for the Medes and the Persians to occupy that land. Then there's Esther, that woman of God who was very reluctant to do what her uncle thought was necessary to save her people. And that extraordinary statements made in that book telling us that Mordecai said to Esther, do you not realize that maybe you've been put here for this very reason? And she stood up, just an ordinary person, stood up to be counted, and she saved her people. My question is, going through all of that, do you see the purpose of the people of the sea settling in Palestine? Yes, they were a thorn in the flesh to the Hebrew people. But do you see in the scope of things how God used them? Sometimes to punish the Hebrew people when they got out of line. But how God kept the Hebrew people on guard for the bigger enemies that were to come, because they had to deal with the Philistines periodically along the way. They had to keep their army to high standards. They had to have more than 2 swords in order to be successful. and they had to stay in the right path with God. God continually uses ordinary things to do extraordinary things in our lives. So that brings me to here, to White House. I think God's using an ordinary church to do extraordinary things. And you can go back through the history. I've updated, read it just recently in preparing this, of the White House Church. You can see that group of people way back that came together, just a few of them, and got things started, and how it built up over time. Then it went through a period of where it plateaued, and then eventually it started declining. And I know from my history with the church at West Irwin that eventually it declined to such a degree that the elders of the White House Church met with the elders at West Irwin to talk to them about, is there ways that we can help this to grow? And a little plan was come up with that maybe we could send some families from West Irwin down to here. So that initial sending of those families, I think it was 11 families, that came here to work. And we're going to get a little personal here. How many of those families are left that initially came? Well, the Duvalls, the Clarks, the who? Hancocks. You see, some of those people that came had to move away. Some of them decided that they were going to be here for a time period, 2 years or whatever it was, and then they went back to where they had come from. And there was a lot of reasons, but eventually that number dwindled back down again. And then about 5 years ago, I think God revisited this work 7 years ago. And no, it's 5 years ago. Another group from West Irwin and other places came in. A larger group than the first group even. And through that effort that was made at that time, the church has steadily gone like this with a few bumps that's caused this maybe to level out. But I think God's looking down at this work. Whenever there was a need, it seems like He's answered that need. In the sending of people that came. Now, we need to understand something. Just because God answered that part of it doesn't mean that He's going to continually be with that. Just because He's willing to say, okay, I'm going to intervene here and we're going to have some people come to White House. What we do with them once they come is up to us. And we can fumble the ball or we can score a touchdown with it. But this is just an ordinary place. There's nothing extraordinary. I don't mean to hurt anybody's feelings. But there's nothing extraordinary about the city of White House. There's something extraordinary about the church wherever it meets, if it's doing things the way God wants it to do. But we can be the success story like we've been going over here. We can be the success story if we're willing to listen and obey God and do what He says to do. There can be glory in the ordinary if that happens. Or we can fumble the ball. And so the choice is going to be ours to make. I think God's done what He needed to do. Just like He did with Philippi, that city, where it humble beginnings, but it grew. It got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then all of a sudden there was a little friction between some of the ladies that were there. And they could have fumbled that. And that could have become a big deal and it could have split the church. But it doesn't appear that that happened. They worked through that. That church became a church of the extraordinary rather than the ordinary. So we have a golden opportunity at White House to bring glory to God through just ordinary things that we do. In our life, as we're living our life, we need to take the gospel along the way. God will give the increase, I believe, if we're willing to do that. Do y'all have a thought on that? Yeah.
God's in control, and He has His timetable. And it may not be the same one as ours, but eventually we will get there. God is faithful.
Yeah. So God, and maybe adversities come for a reason too. We can learn from those too along the way. We can even be stronger after those things happen. But just remember that God can do extraordinary things with just ordinary items or people. And I don't consider us extraordinary only in the sense that we're extraordinary because we believe in God and we believe the things that He says. And I think through that we can do great things in the future. I'm not asking for us to march out into the city tonight and take it back for the glory of God, but I do want to say I really believe that. I believe God has a purpose for this church, and I believe that if we all work together, we can do extraordinary things. Let's bow for a word of prayer. God, thank You for the day that You've given to us, and thank You for the blessings of this life. Please help us to understand that we are here to please You, that we're here to do the things You would have us to do. Please help us focus on those things and do the best that we can. And maybe all of us can do extraordinary things for Your glory. Please build us up in Your service in Christ.